Hello everyone, and welcome back to History with Matt. Today we're going to be discussing the life and legacy of Ronald Wilson Reagan, a man who went from a Hollywood actor and a New Deal Democrat to an icon of the American right. A man who rebirthed the Republican Party, creating the three main branches of the Republican Party: the Christian right, gaining support from the evangelicals; neoliberalism and the advocacy of free markets; and neoconservatism, advocating for interventionist foreign policy. His name is still mentioned to this day, as Republican politicians still evoke Reagan's legacy.
He flew on this plane with Ronald Reagan.
I think Ronald Reagan was one of the great presidents, period.
Ronald Reagan.
So let's delve into the character of the Gipper, the great communicator, the Jelly Bean Guy, or Ronald Reagan. Born February the 6th, 1911, in Topeka, Illinois, Ronald Wilson Reagan was born far away from the lights of Hollywood, on the halls of power in Washington, D.C. His mother, Nell Klein Wilson, was a devout Protestant. His father, John Reagan, was an Irish Catholic travelling businessman who had a strong hatred of the British, and also happened to be an alcoholic, which is quite stereotypical.
Kill a fucking Englishman and throw him in the sea.
His surname had originally been O'Regan. However, once his grandfather left County Tipperary,
Drinking tea.
James Barry, Gerta Gary, Ronald Reagan, Ballybacon, being from Tipperary.
they then had their name anglicised to Reagan once in the United States. He had one older brother, Neil. His family settled down in Dixon, Illinois. Reagan enjoyed playing football as well as acting. You could say he was a 1920s Troy Bolton. He worked as a lifeguard at Rock River in Lowell Park and is credited with having rescued more than 70 people. He studied at Erica College, where he continued stage acting and was captain of both the swimming team and football team. At this time, his interest in politics began, as he was elected student council president, mainly due to his exceptional oratory skills. He graduated with a double major in sociology and economics. After graduating, he became a sports radio announcer in Des Moines, Iowa, during the 1930s, providing mainly baseball commentary. This was during the worst years of the Great Depression, and the Midwest was hit particularly hard by this. His radio coverage on the Iowa Cubs could at least raise their spirits. In 1937, while touring California with the Iowa Cubs, he was asked to do a screen test. Reagan eagerly took this opportunity and subsequently signed a 7-year contract with Warner Brothers. Reagan had just begun his career as a Hollywood movie star, and Bedtime for Bonzo, in which Reagan was nearly suffocated by a chimpanzee. Perhaps the monkey was a Democrat. However, in the movie Brother Rat, he would meet Jane Wyman, and who in 1938 they would meet, and 2 years later they would also get married. The couple would have 2 children together, Maureen and an adopted son, Michael. He got his nickname the Gipper by playing George Gipp in a Newt Rock film. In 1942, Reagan would appear in the film King's Row, a film about how life in the Midwest is not as romanticized in reality.
Randy! Where's the rest of me?
This line from the film would become legendary and be labelled as Reagan's best performance. As this was during World War II, Reagan was called up to service shortly after the film was released. Reagan never left the US, however, due to his poor eyesight. This meant that he would see no active combat. He would, however, be an Air Force Public Relations officer in Culver City, California. Due to his work as an actor, he produced over 400 training films, such as recruitment and cockpit simulation films, over the course of the war. He was discharged on December the 9th with the rank of captain. After the war, Reagan was elected as the president of the Screen Actors Guild, which is a labour union that represented actors and performers. Considering how he would later deal with unions, the irony is not lost on most people. Reagan's tenure as president would come at a turbulent time in Hollywood. The Hollywood blacklist, in which film companies created lists of actors and actresses who they suspected of being communists and barred them from appearing in any movies. Reagan was actually interviewed on numerous occasions on actors that were suspected of being communist sympathizers, or conversely, he would clear the names of those who were falsely accused, such as Nancy Davis. He testified at a House of Un-American Activities committee and stated that some guild members were communists. Reagan also had to deal with the Taft-Hawley Act that was passed in 1947 that restricted the power and activities of labour unions, and he also secured residual payments for actors. He resigned in 1952 before being appointed in 1959 for a second time, before resigning again in 1960. He really didn't want that job when he ended up. This was Reagan's first role in politics and made him think about running statewide. As Reagan's political aspirations grew, his wife Jane Wyman and Reagan's relationship broke down, as Wyman was disinterested in politics and did not wish to become a politician's wife. They divorced in 1949. It also didn't help that Wyman was a conservative Republican and Reagan was a Democratic activist and leader of the Labour Union.
Well, well, well. How the turntables...
Reagan would later campaign for Harry Truman in the 1948 presidential election, which would result in one of the biggest political upsets in US history as well. He supported Helen Douglas's Senate bid in 1950 against future President Richard Nixon. To anyone familiar with Reagan and his policies as president, this may be quite shocking to hear, but it's important to remember that he was raised as a progressive Democrat by his father, who instilled in him a busting labour laws creation of FDR, in which Reagan would call him, at this point, a true hero. It seems he was well on his way to becoming a future Democratic president. So what happened? Reagan, after his divorce, was emotionally drained, however, and had an on-off relationship with Nancy Davis, who Reagan had cleared of communist sympathies at his time as president of the Screen Actors Guild. They married in 1952 and had 2 children, Patricia Reagan and Ronald Prescott Reagan, who both become Democratic activists while their father was president, which caused some tension. Nancy's father was a prominent conservative, and this is said to have changed Reagan's political views, as he endorsed Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon for president in 1952 and 1960. He was contracted by General Electric, in which he gave a speech to the employees speaking of the positive economic effects of the free market. In 1961, he also gave a speech criticizing Medicare, which is a federal health insurance program for those over 65 or those with disabilities, which he called the end of individual freedom in the United States. Reagan was already a gifted orator, but this experience of speaking to ordinary Americans is where he perfected his skill, hence the nickname, the Great Communicator. He left General Electric in 1962 due to not being allowed to become too politically involved and registered as a Republican soon after. In 1964, Reagan gave a speech for the Republican nominee Barry Goldwater. This speech became known as the time for choosing.
Freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. So great as saying to 1 billion human beings now enslaved behind the Iron Curtain, give up your dreams of freedom, because to save our own skins, we're willing to make a deal with your slave masters. Alexander Hamilton said, a nation which can prefer disgrace to danger is prepared for a master and deserves one. Now let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war.
Reagan weaved in humour while lambasting big government. It is a thoroughly impressive speech. Though Goldwater lost in a landslide, like he got completely walloped by LBJ, this speech introduced Reagan and raised his profile with conservatives Americans as a whole. It has been called by some the most successful national political debut since William Jennings Bryan's electrified 1860-96 Democratic Convention with his famous Cross of Gold address. After Goldwater's loss, Reagan looked to capitalise on his new political power. He announced in early 1966 he would run for governor of California.
As of now, I am a candidate seeking the Republican nomination for governor.
In this campaign, Reagan first had to win the Republican nomination. He came up against moderate Republican George Christopher, mayor of San Francisco, and the last Republican to be mayor of the city. George painted Reagan as an extreme. However, Reagan brushed this off, popularizing the 11th commandment of the Republican Party, which is, "Thou shalt not speak ill of any fellow Republican."
Down and the decisions are made as to who the candidates will be, then the 11th commandment prevails and everybody goes to work, and that is, thou shalt not speak ill of another Republican.
Reagan won the primary and was then pitted against incumbent Governor Pat Brown, who 4 years earlier had beat Nixon in an upset. This election is marked by a number of missteps by Brown, as well as his handling of certain political situations, such as the Watts riot in LA that left 34 dead and over 1,000 injured, as well as the UC Berkeley student protests. Though Brown's major gaffe is when he compared Reagan to another actor, John Wilkes Booth. In a state that has a large number of actors and has Hollywood, comparing your political rival to an actor who assassinated Lincoln isn't the best thing to do. Reagan campaigned on uncontrolled spending, the radicals at the University of California, and the need for accountability in government. Reagan would win this race in a landslide, 57-42. As Reagan was inaugurated as governor, his first problem was a massive deficit that Brown had left him. Reagan stopped the hiring of jobs in the state government and presided over the largest state tax increase in US history, raising taxes on property sales and inheritance. This annoyed a lot of conservatives in the state, who seen this as a betrayal. He also had to deal with anti-government student protests,
Ho Chi Minh! Ho Chi Minh is gonna win! Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh! Ho Chi Minh is gonna win! Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh! Ho Chi Minh is gonna win!
which he cracked down on with increased police and bringing in the National Guard, which left one student dead and multiple injured in what was called Bloody Thursday. Reagan signed the Mulford Act to try and combat the Black Panthers by prohibiting the public carrying of firearms. This would be the most restrictive piece of gun control legislation in its time, and served as the foundation of modern gun control legislation that is put forward to this day. Reagan also signed the 1967 Therapeutic Abortion Act, which allowed abortion in the case of rape and incest, and when a doctor determined the birth would impair the physical or mental health of the mother. The last part caused problems, as rather than fully mentally assessing the mother, doctors just decided to do the abortion anyway. He did, however, later regret this decision. He also signed the Family Law Act, which legalized no-fault divorce laws, which is shown to have led to the deterioration of the American family. Reagan ranks highly as governor of California, but he did not absolutely govern as a conservative, as many people believe he did. Due to being the governor of the largest and wealthiest state, and being very popular, it was natural that he would be seen as the candidate for president. He ran unofficially in the 1968 Republican primary, winning California's delegates. However, his first major run president came in 1976, where he ran against President Gerald Ford, who was the incumbent president, who many Republicans saw as insufficiently conservative. Ford is, in my opinion, the last of the old school moderate Republicans. Reagan believed that after Watergate and the resignation of Nixon, as well as Republicans being destroyed in 1974 midterms, he was the man to steady the ship. This was a brutal primary, as both men and their surrogates would throw attacks at one another. Reagan, trying to pull moderate Republicans from Ford, chose Richard Schweiker, Liberal Republican senator of Pennsylvania, as his running mate, which alienated conservatives, allowing Ford to pick up the remaining delegates, winning 1,187 to Reagan's 1,070. This is, to my knowledge, the closest a sitting US president has come to losing the nomination of their party. Ford, trying to unite the party after a divisive primary, invited Reagan on to address the convention, in which he spoke of the freedom and the threat of the Soviet Union. This close primary is one of the factors that contributed to Ford's loss to Jimmy Carter in 1976. In 1980, Reagan was by far the favourite to win the nomination against George H.W. Bush, who would later choose as his running mate. This primary had its own share of interesting moments, such as Bush's voodoo economics.
This type of what I call a voodoo economic policy, it just isn't going to work.
In which Reagan advocated tax cuts while spending more, and Reagan's outburst at one of the debates, where Reagan said,
"Man, please turn Mr. Reagan's mic off for a minute. Is this on? Mr. Green,
Did you turn that microphone
you
off,
asked
please?
for me if you would... I am paying for this microphone, Mr.
Due to Reagan's campaign financing of the debate, after easily winning the nomination, Reagan faced incumbent Democratic President Jimmy Carter, as well as independent John B. Anderson, who was a liberal Republican, who carried support from those disaffected with Carter's liberalism and Reagan's conservatism. Reagan was able to capitalize off Carter's unpopularity due to the Iran hostage crisis and a stagnant economy. Also, per debate performances where Reagan's use of humour made viewers find him appealing.
The national health insurance important to the American people, Governor Reagan again, typically is against such a proposal.
Governor, there you go again. When I opposed Medicare...
However, after a couple of years, it was found out that Reagan's campaign managers were revealed to have obtained Carter's debate briefing book before the debates. This did not mean much though, as Reagan won in a landslide, carrying 44 states and 489 electoral votes to Carter's 6 states and 49 electoral votes. He also became the oldest person to become president, until Joe Biden in 2020 at 78. Reagan's massive victory had coattails, as Republicans won control of the Senate for the first time since 1952 and gained seats in the House in what was called the Reagan Revolution. The era of Reagan had begun. Republicans had been demoralized since Nixon resigned, and Reagan was the perfect man to lead them, with a positive, uplifting attitude, combined with his charisma and humour, and no doubt from his time as an actor, he would lift America out of its slump. Reagan's presidency spans the entire 90s, so we'll break down his administration into domestic and foreign policy. We'll start with domestic. Reaganomics was a neoliberal supply-side economics, which advocated that lowering taxes and decreasing regulations, combined with increased free trade, would boost the economy. Reagan actually raised taxes 11 times, although he did cut taxes, though it is widely accepted that this mostly benefited the wealthy. Critics called this trickle-down economics, in which tax policies that benefited the wealthy would eventually make its way to the poor. Others say this led to the economic boom of the 1990s. This did contribute to income inequality, as while yes, upper middle class Americans benefited, the working class did not, as the number of homeless people increased, as well as the jobs that were created were minimum wage jobs. Reagan cut unemployment benefits, food stamps and subsidized housing, while Reagan ballooned defense spending, increasing the CIA's budget, creating the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, which was a missile defense system that would be able to shoot down nukes out of the sky before they hit the US. This led to tripling of the national debt when he left the presidency. At the very infancy of his presidency, Reagan was shot by John Hinckley Jr. outside the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C.
And here you see the president coming out now. We just have to watch. I don't know whether we can hear this or not. There's shots. God.
25.
Reagan was hit by the ricochet of one of the limousines, breaking his ribs and puncturing his lung. Reagan would recover quickly, however. White House Press Secretary James Brady would have permanent brain damage due to the shooting. Most interestingly is Hinckley did not shoot Reagan for any ideological reason. He shot him due to his obsession with Jodie Foster, believing she would love him for it. This was apparently due to his watching of Taxi Driver, a movie Jodie Foster appeared in. Relating to Travis Bilkley, he has been recently released and uploads videos on YouTube, playing songs he wrote and playing them on his guitar, which is quite surreal, but good for him. Reagan survived, and this massively boosted his popularity. Reagan cracked down on the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization in 1981 by firing all 12,000 strikers, as this was a federal government and he had the power to do so. During Reagan's presidency, the sheriff employees who were part of a labor union dropped from approximately 1/4 of the total workforce to approximately 1/6 of the total workforce. Reagan also ramped up the war on drugs, increasing anti-drug funding, as well as possibly using the CIA to smuggle crack cocaine into black neighborhoods. This was also seen in the disparity of sentences between crack cocaine, which is smoked and is cheaper and used more by black Americans, who usually got tougher sentences, while cocaine in its powdery form is more expensive and used by more affluent, typically professional white Americans, who got less strict sentences. Nancy Reagan also founded the Just Say No, which is widely admonished as being a failure.
Must be how Ronald Reagan felt about Nancy. Nancy, will you make me the happiest man in the world by turning a blind eye to the AIDS crisis and ineffectually trying to warn young people about drugs?
Yes! Oh yes, Ronnie, yes!
If you're too young, those are both things she did.
Reagan's most significant failure is his failure to address the AIDS crisis, which began early 1980. He did not mention it until 1986, and has said that the death of his friend, actor Rock Hudson, affected Reagan, and he started allocating funds to AIDS research, but he was still underfunded, and a total of 50,000 people died of AIDS during Reagan's presidency. It is also worth noting that Ronald Reagan was not a conservative on immigration. He signed one of the biggest amnesty bills ever in American history in 1986, which is single-handedly moved California into becoming a blue state, giving thousands, millions of illegal immigrants citizenship. In foreign policy, Reagan was aggressive, supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviets, supplying them with weapons such as Stinger missiles to shoot down Soviet aircraft. 20 years later, these would be used to shoot down US aircraft. He's also widely praised for his response to the Challenger crash, as he gave a consolatory speech saying that the astronauts did not die for nothing.
And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
As this event was watched live in classrooms all over the US. A strategy called the Reagan Doctrine was used, where the administration would support anti-communist groups, would also increase defense spending, and was done so as the Soviet economy was already stagnating, and would attempt to keep up with the US. This is widely credited with contributing to the collapse of the Soviet Union. His 1985 bombing of Libya, his 1983 invasion of Grenada, a tiny Caribbean nation that had a communist coup, his relationship with Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, and the signing of arms control agreements, as well as his famous Berlin Wall speech.
If you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
He visited Ireland in 1984, leaning into his Irish ancestry. A negative was the Iran-Contra affair, in which the Reagan administration sold weapons to Iran in their war against Iraq, and used the funds to support the Contras in their civil war against the communist Sandinistas in Nicaragua, which was done through Oliver North.
Was their mantra, so we sent them lots of money for guns and landmines. But Congress stopped the Contra money flow, just cause they moved a teeny bit of blow. But then a hero came forth, his name was Oliver North. He and Reagan went around the sissy Congress. Ollie North, Ollie North. You see, North secretly sold missiles to a harmless country called Iran that would always be a grateful ally. Then he gave the profits to the Contras. Genius! But the sales were uncovered by the press. Reagan and North began to stress. Cause what they did was technically high treason. But it was totally justified. North volunteered to take the blame to save Reagan from prison rape's shame. The truth he did bury with his hot secretary, thanks to her shredder. He got off totally scot-free. Ollie North, he's a soldier and a hero.
This affected Reagan's popularity. Reagan also won his re-election in 1984 in one of the biggest ever landslides, winning every single state except Minnesota, which was Walter Mondale's home state, and he was Jimmy Carter's vice president. This was attributed to Reagan's performance in the debates, where he rebuffed doubts on his age.
In history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will... If I still have time, I might add, Mr. Truitt, I might add that it was Seneca or it was Cicero, I don't know which, that said, if it was not for the elders correcting the mistakes of the young, there would be no state.
Mr. President, I'd like to head for the fence and try to catch that one before it goes over, but...
Reagan would leave the presidency and be succeeded by his vice president, George H.W. Bush. Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's shortly after leaving the presidency. This caused him to make few public appearances, and he kept his circle close. This is where the infamous story of the Secret Service continuously putting leaves into his pool would come from, as this would keep him occupied.
I'm at a school to impress my girlfriend. Now, that is not true. Oh, yeah? Well, then why'd you pick Martin Luther King, eh? Why not Ronald Reagan? He was always fun, especially in his later years.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Tear it down. Reagan smash! Reagan smash!
What's that?
Oh, it's just Reagan. Just leave him alone. He'll tire himself out.
Reagan sleepy.
Reagan died on June 5th, 2004, 1893. His funeral was attended by his closest foreign ally, Margaret Thatcher, as the two had a close bond during their times as leader of their respective countries. And that was Ronald Reagan, the man who would be the most influential president since FDR. He brought about a time of a revived American self-respect, and Reagan personified that, with his puns and quips, always lightening the mood, sometimes at his own expense.
Claims he's the new Thomas Jefferson. Well, let me tell you something. I knew Thomas Jefferson. He was a friend of mine. And Governor, you're no Thomas Jefferson.
He helped bring down the Soviet Union and led a new conservative movement that still invokes his name to this day.
Everyone prays to a proper right-wing God.
And that is his enduring legacy. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe, as this would be very much appreciated, and I welcome your feedback in the comments. I've been History with Matt. Thank you very much for watching.